Alright, let's continue. Oversea, Understone. I meant to get back to this earlier, but couldn't because of certain things. Anyway, Chapter 3. As Simon's head emerged through the hatch at the top, he caught his breath just as Barney had. Ah! Ah! And sneezed enormously. Clouds of dust rose, and the ladder shook. Hey! Said Barney protestingly from below, drawing his face back from his brother's twitching heels. Simon opened his watering eyes and blinked. Before him and all around was one vast attic, the length and breadth of the whole house, with two grubby windows in its sloping roof. It was piled to higgledy-piggledy with the most fantastic collection of objects he had ever seen. Boxes, chests, and trunks lay everywhere, with mounds of dirty gray canvas and rough coiled ropes between them, stacks of newspapers and magazines, yellow-brown with age, a brass bedstead, and a grandfather clock without a face. As he stared, he saw smaller things. A broken fishing rod, a straw hat perched on the corner of an oil painting darkened by age into one great black burr, an empty mousetrap, a ship in a bottle, a glass-fronted case full of chunks of rock. A pair of old thigh-high boots flopped over sideways as if they were tired, a cluster of battered pewter mugs. Gosh, said Simon. Muffled noises of protest came from below, and he hauled himself out through the opening and rolled sideways out of their way on the floor. Barney and Jane came through after him. Simon, said Jane, gazing at him in horror, you're filthy! Well, isn't that just like a girl? All this round you and you only see a bit of dust. It'll brush off. He patted ineffectually at his piebald shirt. But isn't it marvelous? Look! Barney, cooing with delight, was picking his way across the littered floor. There's an old ship's wheel, and a rocking chair, and a saddle. I wonder if the captain ever had a horse. Jane had been trying to look insulted, but failed. This is something like exploring. We might find anything up here. It's a treasure cave. This is what the natives were after. Hear them howling in it with frustrated rage down there? Dancing round in a circle with the witch doctor cursing us all. Well, he can curse away, Barney said cheerfully. We've got enough provisions for ages. I'm hungry. Oh, not yet. You can't be. It's only 4 o'clock. Well, that's tea time. Anyway, when you're on the run, you can eat a little and often, because you daren't ever stop for long. If we were Eskimos, we'd be chewing on old shoelace. My book says... Never mind your book, Simon said. He fished inside the rucksack. Here, have an apple and keep quiet. I want to look at everything properly before we have our picnic. And if I can wait, so can you. I don't see why, Barney said, but he bit into his apple cheerfully and wandered across the floor, disappearing between a high brass skeleton of the old bed and an empty cupboard. For half an hour they poked about in a happy, dusty dream through the junk and broken furniture and ornaments. It was like reading the story of somebody's life, Jane thought, as she gazed at the tiny matchstick masts of the ship sailing motionless forever in a green glass bottle. All of these things had been used once, had been part of every day in the house below. Someone had slept on the bed, anxiously watched the minutes on the clock, pounced joyfully on each magazine as it arrived. But all those people were long dead or gone away, and now the oddments of their lives were piled up here, forgotten. She found herself feeling rather sad. I'm ravenous, Barney said plaintively. I'm thirsty. It's all that dust. Come on, let's unload Mrs. Polk's tea. This attic's rather a swizz. This attic's rather a swizz, Simon said, squatting on the crackling edge of canvas and unloading the rucksack. All the really interesting boxes are locked. Look at that one, for instance. He nodded towards the black metal chest with 2 rusting padlocks on its lid. I bet it's full of family jewels. Well, Jane said regretfully, we aren't supposed to touch anything locked, are we? There's a lot not locked, Simon said, handing her the bottle of lemonade. Here, you'll have a swig from the bottle. We forgot to bring any cups. Don't worry, we won't pinch anything, though I shouldn't think anyone's been up here for years. Food, Barney said. The scones are in that bag there. Help yourself. 4 each, I've counted. Barney reached out an extremely dirty hand. Barney, Jane squeaked, wipe your hand. You'll eat all sorts of germs and get typhoid or rabies or something. Here, have my handkerchief. Rabies is mad dogs, Barney said, looking with interest at the black fingerprints on his scone. Anyway, Father says people make too much fuss about germs. Oh, all right, Jane. Stop waving that silly thing at me. I've got a proper handkerchief of my own. I don't know how girls ever blow their noses. Scowling, he thrust his free hand into his pocket, and his expression changed to disgust. Ugh, he says as he brought out a brown squashed apple core. I'd forgotten that, all cold and horrible. He flung the core away from him into a far corner of the attic. It bounced, slithered, and rolled into the shadows. Simon grinned. Now you'll bring the rats out. All attics have rats. We shall hear the greedy little squeakings and see twin green points of fire, and there'll be rats all over the floor. First they'll eat the apple core, then they'll come after us. Jane turned pale. Oh no, there won't be rats up here, would there? If there were, they'd have eaten all the newspapers, Barney said hopefully. Wouldn't they? I'd expect they don't like ink. All old houses have rats. We've got them at school. You can hear them scuttling about on the roof sometimes. Come to think of it, their eyes are red, not green. Simon's voice began to lose its brightness. He was beginning to feel slightly unhappy about the rats himself now. I think maybe you'd better pick that apple core up. You know, just in case. Barney gave an exaggerated sigh and got to his feet, swallowing his scone in 2 gigantic bites. Where did it go, then? Over there somewhere. I wonder why they didn't put anything in this corner. He crawled about on his hands and knees aimlessly. Come and help, I can't find it. Then he noticed a triangular gap in the sloping wall of the attic where its planks joined the floor. He peered through and saw daylight gleaming dimly through the tiles. Just inside the gap, the floorboards ended, and he could feel wide-spaced beams. I think it must have gone through this hole, he called. I'm going to look. Jane dived across the floor towards him. Oh, do be careful. There might be a rat. Couldn't be, Barney said halfway through the gap. There's a light coming through the tiles, and I can see more or less. Can't see any core, though. I wonder if it fell between the floorboards and the underneath part. Ow! His rear half jerked suddenly. What is it? Oh, do come out! Jane tugged at his shorts. I touched something, but it can't be a rat. It didn't move. Where's it gone? Here it is. Feels like cardboard. Blah. Ah. Here's that disgusting core next to it as well. His voice grew suddenly louder as he backed out of the hole, flushed and blinking. Well, there it is, he said triumphantly, flourishing the apple core. Now the rats will have to come and get it. I still don't believe there are any. What's the other thing you've got? Simon looked curiously at the tattered scroll-like object in Barney's other hand. Piece of wallpaper, I think. I bet you've eaten all the scones, you pigs. Barney bounded back across the floor, making the floorboards rattle. He sat down, pulled his handkerchief out, and waved it ostentatiously at Jane, wiped his hands, and began to munch another scone. As they ate, he reached over and idly unrolled the scroll he had found, holding one end down on the floor with his toe and pushing the other back with a piece of wood until it lay stretched open before them. And then, as they saw what it was, they all suddenly forgot their eating and stared. The paper Barney had unrolled was not paper at all, but a kind of thick, brownish parchment, springy as steel with long raised cracks across it where it had been rolled. Inside it, another sheet was stuck down, darker, looking much older, ragged at the edges, and covered with small writing in a strange, squashed-looking brown letters. Below the writing it dwindled, as if it had been singed by some great heat long ago, into half-detached pieces carefully laid back together and stuck to the outer sheet. But there was enough of it left for them to see at the bottom a rough drawing of what looked like an uncertain outline of a map. For a moment they were all very quiet. Barney said nothing, but he could feel a strange excitement bubbling up inside him. He leaned forward in silence and carefully stretched the manuscript flat, pushing the piece of wood aside. Here, Simon said, I'll get something to weight the edges down. They put an old paperweight, a pewter mug, 2 carefully dusted chunks of wood on the corners, and sat back on their heels to look. It's terribly old, Jane said. Centuries, thousands of years. like those papers in glass cases in museums with little curtains to keep the light out. Where did it come from? How did it get up here? Somebody must have hidden it. But it's older than the house. I mean, look at it. It must be. Some of the writing's nearly faded away. It wasn't hidden, Barney said with absolute conviction, though he had no clear idea why. Someone just threw it down where I found it. Simon whooped suddenly, making them jump. This is terrific! Do you realize we've got a real live treasure map? It could lead us to anything, anywhere, secret passages, real hidden caves, the treasure of Treswick. He rolled the words lovingly around on his tongue. There isn't much map, it's all writing. Well, then that's instructions. Look in ye little room on ye second floor, I expect it says. Ye second floorboard on, ye left... When this was written, there weren't such things as floorboards. Oh, come off it, it's not that old. I bet it is, Barney said quietly. Anyway, you look at this writing. You can't read it. It's all this in some funny language. Of course you can read it if you look properly, Simon said impatiently. In his mind, he was already halfway through a sliding panel, throwing back the lid of a chest to reveal the hoards of untold wealth. He could almost hear the chink of doubloons. Let's have a look. He leaned forward, but the floorboards hard and rough under his knees, and peered at the manuscript. There was a long pause. Oh, he said at last, reluctantly. Barney said nothing, but looked at him very expressively indeed. Well, all right, said Simon. There's no need to look so cocky. It isn't in English, but that doesn't mean we shan't be able to find out what it says. Why isn't it in English? How on earth should I know? I mean, Barney said patiently, that we're in England, so what other language could it possibly be in? Latin, Jane said unexpectedly. She'd been looking quietly at this manuscript over Simon's shoulder. Latin? Yes, all old manuscripts are written in Latin. The monks used to write them down with goose feather for a pen, and put flowers and birds and things all squiggling around the capital letters. There isn't anything squiggling here. It looks as if it's been written in rather a hurry. I can't even see any capital letters at all. But why Latin? Demanded Barney. I don't know. It's just all... The monks just always used it, that's all. It was one of their things, I suppose. It's a religious-sounding kind of language. Well, Simon does Latin. Yes, come on, Simon, translate it, Jane said maliciously. At school she had not yet begun Latin, but he had been learning it for 2 years, and was rather superior about the fact. I don't think it's Latin at all, Simon said rebelliously. He peered at the manuscript again. The writing's so odd. The letters all look the same. Like a lot of little straight lines and all in a row. And the light here isn't very good either. You're just making excuses. No, I'm not. It's jolly difficult. Well, if you can't even recognize Latin when you see it, you can't nearly be as good as you make out. Have another look, said Barney hopefully. I think it's in 2 parts, Simon said slowly. One little paragraph on top, and then a lot more altogether after a gap. The second bit I can't make out at all, but the first paragraph does look as if it might be Latin. The first words look like cum, that means with, but I can't see what comes after it. Then later on there's post multos annos, that's after many years. But the writing's all so small and squashy I can't... Wait a minute, there's some names on the last line. It says Marco Altoroque. And this is me going off of my 4 years of Latin that I last heard of 10 years ago. So bear with me. I don't know. I know some of my pronunciation is right. I don't know if all of it is right. Probably not, because again, that was officially 10 years ago. Oh my god. Okay. That was officially 10 years ago this September, which is terrifying for me, so thank you. I'm gonna have an existential crisis while I read the rest of this. Like Marco Polo, Jane said doubtfully. What a funny name. Not one name, it's 2. Que means and, only they put it on the end instead of in the middle, and O on the end is the ablative of us. So this means by, with, or from Marcus and Arturus. by, with, or from. This is true. Latin's a weird language. Barney, whatever's the matter? Barney, red in the face and sputtering, had suddenly thumped his fists to the floor, caught his breath trying to say something, then collapsed into a thunderous fit of coughing. They patted him on the back and gave him a drink of lemonade. Marcus and Arthurus, he said hoarsely, gulping in his breath back. Don't you see? It's Mark and Arthur. It's about King Arthur and his knights. Mark was one of them, and he was the King of Cornwall. It must be about them. Gosh, Simon said. I think he's right. It must be that. I bet old King Mark left some treasure behind somewhere, and that's why there's a map. Suppose we find it. We'd be rich. We'd be famous. We shall have to tell Mother and Father, Jane said. The two boys stopped thumping each other ecstatically and looked at her. Whatever for? Well, Jane said, lamely taken aback. I suppose we ought to, that's all. Barney sat back on his heels again, frowning, and rifled his fingers through his hair, which by now looked several shades darker than it had when they came up to the attic. I wonder what they'd say. I know what they'd say, Simon said promptly. They'd say it was all our imagination, and anyway they'd tell us to put the manuscript back where we found it, because it isn't ours. Well, said Jane, it isn't, is it? It's a treasure trove. Findings, keepings. But we've found it in someone else's house. It belongs to the captain. You know what Mother said about not touching anything? She said anything that was put away. This wasn't put away, and it was just chucked down in a corner. I found it, Barney said. It was all forgotten and dusty. I bet you anything the captain hasn't a clue it was there. Oh, honestly, Jane, Simon said. You can't find a treasure map and just say, oh, how nice, and put it back again. And that's what they'd make us do. Oh, well, Jane said doubtfully. I suppose you're right. We can always put it back afterwards. Jane had turned to the manuscript again. Hey, he said, look at this top part. The old manuscript that's stuck down on the parchment. What's it made of? I thought it was parchment like the outside bit, but when you look at it, it's not. And it's not paper either. It's funny, thick stuff. And it's hard like wood. He touched the edge of the strange brown surface gingerly with one finger. Be careful, Jane said nervously. It might crumble away into dust before our eyes or something. I suppose you'd still want to go showing everyone even then, Simon said acidly. Look what we've found. Does it matter if we touch it? And show them a little heap of dust in a matchbox. Jane said nothing. Oh, well, never mind, Simon said, relenting. She meant well after all. Hey, it's getting awfully dark up here. Do you think we ought to go down? They'll be looking for us soon, and Mother will have stopped painting. It is getting late. Jane looked around the attic and shivered suddenly. The big echoing room was growing dark, and there was a dismal sound now to the rain faintly tapping on the glass. Back in their bedrooms, the boys' wardrobe pushed in again to hide the small secret door. They washed and changed hurriedly as the curt clang of the ship's bell calling them to the supper echoed up the stairs. Simon changed his dusty shirt, rolling the clean one into a crumpled ball before he put it on, hoping no one would notice it was fresh. There was not very much they could do about Barney's hair, now khaki. It's like what Mother says about the rug in the living room at home, Jane said in despair, trying to brush out the dust while her brother wriggled in protest. Chose every mark. Perhaps we ought to wash it, Simon said, peering at Barney critically. No, Barney said. Oh, well, there isn't any time, really. Anyway, I'm hungry. You'll just have to sit away from the light. But when they were all sitting round the supper table, it soon came clear that no one was going to ask any questions about where they had been. The evening began as one of those times when everything seemed determined to go wrong. Mother looked tired and depressed and did not say very much. Signs they knew that her day's painting had not been a success. Father, gloomy after the grey day, erupted into wrath when Rufus bounced in, dripping from his walk, and banished him to the kitchen with Mrs. Polk. Great-uncle Mary had come in silent, thoughtful, mysteriously brooding. He sat at one end of the table alone, staring at the middle distance, like a great carved totem pole. The children eyed him warily, and took care to pass him the salt before he had to ask. But Great-uncle Mary scarcely seemed to see them. He ate automatically, picking up his food and guiding it to his mouth without taking the slightest notice of it. Barney wondered for a wistful moment what would happen if he were to slip a cork table map onto his great-uncle's plate. Mrs. Polk came in with an enormous apple tart and a dish of mounded yellow cream and clattered the dirty plates into a pile. She went out down the hall, and they heard the rich rolling contralto of "Oh God, our help in ages past" echoing into the distance. Father sighed. "There are times," he said irritably, "when I could dispense with devotions at every meal." "The Cornish," boomed Great Uncle Mary from the shadows, "are a devout and evangelical people." "I dare say," said Father. He passed Simon the cream. Simon helped himself into a large spoonful, and a yellow blob dropped from the spoon to the tablecloth. "Oh, Simon," Mother said, "do look what you're doing." "I couldn't help it, it just fell." "That comes from trying to take too much at once," Father said. "Well, you like it too." "Possibly, but I don't try to transport a quart in a pint pot." What do you mean?" "Never mind," Father said. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Simon, that's just making it worse." Simon, in an attempt to retrieve the blob of cream with his spoon, had left a large yellow smear on the cloth. "Sorry." "I should think so." Did you go fishing today, Father?" Jane said hopefully from across the table, feeling that it was time to change the subject. "No," said Father. "Don't be stupid," said Simon ungratefully, still smarting. "It was raining." "Well, Father does go fishing in the rain sometimes." "No, he doesn't." "Yes, he does." If I may be allowed to explain my own actions, Father said with heavy sarcasm, "occasionally I have been known to go fishing in the rain. Today I did not. Is that comprehensible?" Have some apple tart, dear," said Mother, handing him a plate. Father said, glancing at her sideways, and he lapsed into silence. After a moment, he said hopefully, "Might be an idea if we all went for a walk after supper. It seems to be clearing up." Everyone looked out of the window, and the temperature of the room rose several degrees. Over the sea, the clouds had been broken, leaving a deepening blue sky, and the opposite headland glowed suddenly a brighter green as the sinking sun rose for the first time that day. Then they heard the doorbell ring. "Father," Mother said wearily, "whoever can that be?" Mrs. Polk's footsteps rang briskly past the door and then back again. She put her head in. "'Tis some people for you, Dr. Drew." "Stand by to repel boarders," Father said, and he went out into the hall. In a few moments he was back, talking to someone over his shoulder as he came through the door. "Very kind of you indeed. We hadn't really thought that what we were going to do tomorrow. They're an independent lot, you know. Well, here they are." He beamed heartily round with what the family all called his public face. "My wife, Simon, Jane, Barney, and this is Mr. and Miss Withers, from that yacht you admire so much, Simon. We met in the harbor this morning." A man and a girl stood behind him in the doorway. Both were dark-tanned with beaming smiles, bright as the sun in sun-tanned faces. They looked like beings suddenly materialized from another very tidy planet. The man stood forward, holding out his hand. "How do you do, Mrs. Drew?" They sat, staring blankly at him as he advanced towards Mother. He wore dazzling white flannel trousers and a white blazer with a dark blue scarf tucked in the neck of his white shirt. And they had not expected to see anything like him in Trewisick at all. Then they jumped up hastily as Mother stood to shake hands, and Simon knocked over his chair. Into the confusion, Mrs. Polk appeared with a large teapot and a tray of cups and saucers. "2 extra cups," she said, smiling blandly, and departed again. "Do sit down," the girl said. "We only popped in for a moment. We didn't want to interrupt." She bent to help Simon pick up his chair. Her black curls bobbed forward over her forehead. She was a very pretty girl, Jane thought, watching her. Much older than any of them, of course. She wore a bright green shirt and black trousers. Her eyes seemed to twinkle with a kind of private laughter. Jane suddenly felt extremely young. Mr. Withers, showing a lot of very white teeth, was talking to Mother. "Mrs. Drew, do please forgive this intrusion. We had no intention of breaking into your supper." "Not at all," said Mother, looking faintly bemused. "Won't you have a cup of tea?" "Thank you, no, most kind, but we have a meal waiting on the boat. We simply came to issue an invitation. My sister and I are in Trewisick for some days with the yacht to ourselves. On our way round the coast, you know, and we were wondering whether you and the children would care to spend a day out at sea. We have—" Gosh! Simon nearly upset his chair again. "How marvelous! You mean to go out on that fabulous boat?" "I do indeed," said the smiling Mr. Withers. Simon spluttered without words, his face glowing with delight. Mother said hesitantly, "Well, of course I realize we're descending on you out of the blue," Mr. Withers said soothingly, "but it would be pleasant to have company for a change. And when we met your husband in the harvest master's office this morning and discovered we were neighbors in London—" "Are you?" said Barney curiously from the table. "Where?" "Marylebone High Street, just round the corner from you," the girl said, dimpling at him. "Norman sells antiques." She looked across at Mother. "I expect you and I use the same shops, Mrs. Drew. You know the little patisserie where you can get those gorgeous rumbabas?" "I am so sorry." "I try not to," Mother said, beginning to smile. "Well, really, this is very kind considering we're strangers, but I'm not sure whether— well, the three of them can be rather a handful, you know." "Mother!" Simon looked aghast. Mr. Withers puckered his nose boyishly at her. "But my invitation extends to the whole family, Mrs. Drew. We sincerely hope you and your husband will join our little crew as well. Just a trip out and back, you understand, round the bay, as the commercial gentlemen have it. But, with perhaps a little fishing. I shall enjoy showing off the boat. Tomorrow, perhaps? They say it should be a fine day." What an old-fashioned way of talking he has, Jane thought idly. Perhaps it comes with selling antiques. She looked at Simon and Barney, both all eagerness at the idea of a day on the strange yacht, gazing anxiously at their parents. And then back at Mr. Withers' immaculate white flannels and folded scarf. "I don't like him," she thought. "I wonder why." "Well, thank you very much indeed," Mother said finally. "I don't think I shall come, if you'll forgive me. If the sun comes out I shall go and work up above the harbour, but I know Dick and the children would love to go." "Ah, yes, Dr. Drew was telling us about your painting," Mr. Withers said warmly. "Well, the loss will be ours. But if the muse calls, dear lady, the rest of the family will come, though, I hope." "Not half," said Simon swiftly. "It sounds smashing," Barney said. He added as an afterthought, "Thank you very much." "Well," said Father cheerfully, "it is a noble gesture, I must say. We're all very grateful to you. As a matter of fact," he looked vaguely around the room, "there should have been one other member of the family here, but he seems to have disappeared. My wife's uncle. He rented the house for us." The children automatically followed his gaze round the room. They had forgotten great Uncle Mary. Now they realized that there had been no sign of him since the two sudden visitors appeared. The door that led into the breakfast room at the back of the house stood slightly open, but when Barney ran across the room to look, there was no one there. "Professor Lyon, you mean?" the girl said. "That's right." Father stared at her for a moment. "I didn't think I'd mentioned him this morning. Do you know him, then?" Mr. Withers answered for her, quickly and smoothly. "I believe we have met, once or twice, in another sphere than this. In the course of our work, you know. A charming old gentleman, as I remember, but a little unpredictable." "That he certainly is," Mother said ruefully. "Always dashing off somewhere. He hasn't even finished his supper this time. But do let me give you some tea or coffee." "Thank you, but I think we should be getting back," the girl said. "Vane will have supper waiting." Mr. Withers pulled down the edges of his immaculate blazer with a precise feminine gesture. "You're quite right, Polly. We mustn't be late." He swung his white smile round the room like a lighthouse. "Vane is our skipper, the professional on board, and an excellent chef, too. You must sample his cooking tomorrow. Well, now, shall we see you all down in the harbor if the weather is fine? 9:30, perhaps. We will have a dinghy waiting on the quay. Splendid. Father moved with him out into the hall, and everyone straggled after them. On the way, Polly Withers paused and looked up over Simon's head at the old Cornish maps hanging around the oil paintings in the dark hall. Do look, Norman. Aren't they marvelous? She turned to Mother. This really is a wonderful house. Did your uncle rent it from a friend? A Captain Tom's. We've never met him. He's abroad. Quite an old man, a retired sailor of some kind. I believe his family have owned Grey House for years. A fascinating place. Mr. Wither was looking about him with a professional eye. He has some beautiful old books, I see. He reached one hand idly down to the door of a long, low bookcase in the hall. It would not open. I keep everything locked, Father said. You know what it is with a furnished house. One's always nervous of damaging things. An admirable principle, Mr. Wither said formally, but his sister was smiling down at Simon. I bet it's a wonderful place to explore, though, isn't it? She said. Have you children been looking for secret tunnels and things yet? I know I should have done in an old house. Do let us know if you find one. Simon said politely, feeling Barney's anxious eyes on his back. Oh, I don't think there's anything like that here. Well, till tomorrow, then, Mr. Withers said from the doorstep, and they were gone. Isn't that terrific? Barney said eagerly when the door closed. A whole day out on that yacht. Do you think they'll let us help sail her? Mind you keep out of their way until you're asked, Father said. We don't want any casualties. Well, you'll be the ship's doctor. I'm on holiday, remember? Why didn't you tell us you'd met them? Demanded Simon. I was going to, Father said meekly. I expect I was too busy being irritable. He grinned. You can let Rufus out now if you want to, Barney. But he's not going on the boat tomorrow, so don't ask. Jane said suddenly, I don't think I will either. Well, for goodness sake, Simon stared at her. Why ever not? I should get seasick. Of course you wouldn't. Not under sail. There won't be any smelly old engine running. Oh, come on, Jane. No, said Jane more firmly. I'm not batty about boats like you are. I really don't want to go. They won't mind at all, will they, Father? Simon said in disgust. You must be nuts. Leave her alone, said his father. She knows her own mind. No, they'll understand, Jane. No one would want you to be worried about getting ill. See how you feel about going in the morning, though. I do think it will be safer not, Jane said, but she said nothing about her real reason for not wanting to go. It would have sounded too silly to explain that she felt a strange uneasiness about the tall, white yacht, about the smiling Mr. Withers and his pretty sister. The more she thought about it, the sillier it seemed, so that in the end she convinced herself, as well as everybody else, that her reason for avoiding the trip was nothing but fear of seasickness. But again, nobody knew where Great-Uncle Mary had gone. Chapter 4. It's a good windy day out today. It's all atmospheric. Chapter 4. A white morning haze lay over the sea, and down in the harbor the boats shifted idly on still water, bright under the sun. Jane peered down from her window. The fishing boats were deserted, but she could see two small figures clambering from a dinghy beside the quay. Simon stood behind her. I brought this for you to look after, if you really aren't coming. She turned and saw him holding out a gray woolen sock. It looked peculiarly stiff and cylindrical. What on earth's so special about your socks? Simon grinned but lowered his voice. It's the manuscript. I couldn't think of anything else to put it in. Jane laughed, took the sock, and pulled the manuscript out halfway. But even though she handled it gently, the edges cracked and crumpled ominously as they caught in the wool. Hey, she said, alarmed, if that's going to happen every time, this whole thing will fall to bits in a week. It was all right up in the attic, lying there for a few years without anyone touching it, but if we're going to carry it around, Simon looked anxiously at the curled parchment, its battered edges dark with age, and saw cracks that had not been there before. He stood troubled. But we'll have to handle it so much if we're going to find out what it means. Wait a minute, though. That room... Leaving Jane baffled, he seized the manuscript and ran downstairs to a small dark door on the first-floor landing, which led to the passage that they had discovered on the way to the attic. It was still unlocked. He stepped down into the tiny passage, and across the bare, austere room they had decided was the captain's bedroom, It was just as it had been the day before. The telescope case was still laying on the windowsill. Simon picked up this case and unscrewed it. The thread of each half was bright and untarnished, shining with a faint film of oil. The copper lining inside, when he held it up to the light, glinted dry and clean. He dropped the rolled manuscript inside. It fitted perfectly, resting snugly between the two halves when he screwed them together again. Simon looked thoughtfully around the room, as if it might tell him something, but there was nothing but the silence and the mysterious lived-in emptiness, and he closed the door again, gently, and ran back upstairs. "Look," he said to Jane, "might have been made for it." "Perhaps it was," said Jane, taking the case. "You'd better hide it somewhere," said Simon. "What about the top of our wardrobe?" "I'll think of a good place," said Jane thoughtfully. But Simon, half back to his own room already, hardly heard her. Already his mind was racing ahead to the day on the Witherses' yacht. By the time he, Barney, and Father were gone, in a great scuffle of argument over oilskins and pullovers and bathing trunks, Jane was almost beginning to wish she had changed her mind and gone too. But she said firmly to Simon's final jeers, "No, I'd only spoil it all if I got sick." And instead she stood watching from the window as they ran down to the quay, and the little dinghy bobbed out to the tall, slim, white yacht. Her mother, easel under one arm, and a bag of sandwiches and paints in the other hand, looked at her doubtfully. "Darling, are you sure you aren't going to be lonely?" "Goodness, no," said Jane stoutly. "I shall just wander about. It'll be fun, honestly. I mean, you don't get lonely when you're painting, do you?" Mother laughed. "All right, Independence, you wander. Don't get lost. I shall be up above the harbor on the other side if you want me. Mrs. Polk's going to be here all day. She'll get your lunch. Why don't you take Rufus for a walk?" She went out into the sunshine, her eyes already vague with the shape and color of her painting. Jane felt a wet nose push at her hand and looked down at Rufus's large, hopeful brown eyes, laughed and ran off with him down into the village. Through the small, strange streets and the Cornish voices lilting from doorways of the shops. But all morning she felt curiously restless, as if something were jostling to push itself to the front of her mind, and as if she thought her mind were trying to say something to her that she couldn't quite hear. When she brought Rufus home, to collapse in a panting red heap in the kitchen beside Mrs. Polk, she was still thoughtful and subdued. "Nice walk, lovely," said Mrs. Polk, sitting back on her heels. She had a bucket of soapy water beside her, and her face was red and shiny. She'd been scrubbing the gray slate floor. Jane said vaguely. She fiddled with the bow on her ponytail. "Have his lunch ready in just a minute," Mrs. Polk said, scrambling to her feet. "My, just look at that dog, proper wore out. Needs a drink of water, I'll be bound." She reached for Rufus's dish. I'll go up and wash," Jane wandered out through the hall, the cool, dark passage with the sunlight shafting on one of the old maps that Polly Withers had exclaimed over with delight. Miss Withers. Why should she and her brother have seemed sinister? They were perfectly ordinary people. There was no real reason to think otherwise. It was kind of them to have asked everyone out for a day on the yacht. Odd, though, that remark she'd made about exploring and finding things. Finding things. Halfway up the stairs, Jane remembered with a sudden shock of guilt that she had left the manuscript alone all morning, shut in its new case in the drawer of her bedside table. Should she have taken it with her? No, don't be silly, she thought. But she scuttled up the stairs and into her room anxiously and felt a surge of relief as she saw the case lying quietly, glinting in the drawer. She drew out the brown roll of parchment and took it to the window, gingerly straightening it out. The lines of cramped black lettering gave her the same shiver of uneasy excitement that she had felt in the attic at that moment when suddenly they had all three realized what they were looking at. She peered at it, but the squat chunks of words were no more legible now than they had been. She could just make out the initials of the words that Simon had said were Mark and Arthur. How were they ever to find out what it all meant? She looked down at the bottom of the curling sheet, at the few thin, wavering lines that they had thought might be a map. In the dim light of the attic there had been little there to see, but now Jane had full white glare of midday. She bent closer, suddenly realizing that there were more lines in the map than she had noticed at first. Lines so faint that before she had mistaken them for cracks, and among them, fainter still, some words were written. It was a very rough map, as if it had been hurriedly drawn. It seemed to be a coastline, looking rather like the letter W laying on its side, with two inlets and a headland. Or was it two headlands and an inlet? There was no way of telling which side was supposed to be the sea, and although she could just see where there was a word written across one of the projecting arms of land or sea, it was made totally unreadable by one of the breaks in the ancient crumbling parchment, a crack crossing the word out as neatly as if it had been a thick ink line. Blech. Bother, said Jane crossly aloud. She realized as she said it that she had been determined in the last minute to have some discovery of her own about the manuscript, or to announce to Simon and Barney when they came back from their day on the boat. That was what had been niggling at the back of her mind all morning. One other name was written across the map. If it was a name. The letters were small and brown, but more distinct than those of the rest of the manuscript. Jane worked them out one by one and found they made 3 words. Ring, mark, heed. Heed is spelled H-E-D-E, just so you guys know. She stared, disappointed. It meant nothing. Ring, mark, heed, she said experimentally. It wasn't even a place. How could a place have a name like that? The clang of the ship's bell in the hall came echoing up the stairs, breaking the stillness of the sea's murmur and the distant gulls as she heard Mrs. Polk calling faintly below. Jane! Jane! She hastily rolled up the manuscript and dropped it back into the telescope case, screwing the 2 halves tight together. She opened the drawer of her bedside table, hesitant for a moment, then shut it again. Better not let it out of her sight. She snatched a cardigan from the bed and wrapped it around the case, and ran out and down the stairs, 2 at a time. But she was too fast. Swinging around a corner of the first-floor landing, she bumped against a low wooden chest lying in the shadows and yelped with pain. It would have to be the same leg that she hurt on the quay. But as she bent to rub her knee, something drew her attention. The chest she had knocked against was one of the ones they had noticed the day before, with the lid locked. Native golden ornaments, Simon had said, when he found he couldn't open it. But now the lid had sprung open a few inches, and was rocking gently up and down. It must have been stuck, not locked. Her collision had jerked it loose. Curiously, Jane lifted it fully open. There was not much inside. Some old newspapers, a big pair of leather gloves, 2 or 3 heavy woolen sweaters, and, half hidden, a small black-covered book. A very dull treasure, she thought. I would wear those sweaters. I'm not lying. The book might be interesting. She reached down inside and picked it up. Jane! Mrs. Pollock's voice was nearer, coming up the stairs. Guiltily, Jane dropped the lid and bundled the little book inside the folds of her cardigan with the telescope case. Mrs. Polk's face puffed into view through the banisters. Coming, Jane said meekly. Ah, there. Thought he'd gone to bed. Getting too far for these stairs I am. Getting too fat for these stairs I am. Mrs. Polk beamed at her. Lunch is on the table. I were taking me pastry out of the oven, or I'd not have kept ye so long. She waddled back to the kitchen. A mounded plateful of ham and salad waited for Jane in the dining room, like a small bright island in the glossy sea of polished mahogany table. Beside it was a dish of gooseberry tart and a small jug of cream. Jane sat down and ate everything absently, leafing with one hand through the little book she had found in the chest. It was a guidebook to the village, written by the local vicar. A short guide to Trevisick, said the title page, in flowing curly type, compiled by the Reverend E.J. Hawes Mellor, M.A., Oxon, LL.D., London, vicar of the parish church of St. John, Trevisick. Not exciting, thought Jane, her interest dying. She flipped through the narrow pages full of details of rambles through the countryside around. The words from the manuscript were still swimming before her mind. If only she could have something to tell Simon and Barney about the map. It was then that the guidebook fell open at its center page under her fingers. Jane glanced down idly and then paused. The page showed a detailed map of Trevisick village, with every street straight and winding patterned behind the harbor. It lay snug between its two headlands. The churches, the village hall, were all separately marked. She saw with a quick thrill of pride the grey house was marked by name on the road that led up to the tip of Kemar Head and then faded into nothing. But what caught her attention was the name written neatly across the headland. It read, King Mark's Head. Jane said, King Mark's Head, said Jane, slowly aloud. She reached down to the bundled cardigan lying beside her chair, drew out the telescope case, and unrolled the manuscript on the table. The words stared up at her, cramped and enigmatic. Ring, mark, heed. But as she looked, she saw that the first letter of the first word, blurred with age and dirt, might very well not be an R, but a K. She gulped with excitement and took a deep breath. King Mark's Head, the same name on both maps. So that the map on the manuscript from the attic must be a map of Trevisick, of that very part of Trevisick on which the grey house stood. The strange words must be an old name for Kenmare Head. But when the first delighted shock had washed over her, she looked again from one map to the other, and her spirits sank a little. There was something very odd about the wavering outline of the coast drawn on the old manuscript, something more than the inaccuracies you would find on a rough freehand drawing. The lines of the coast were not the same as the ones in the guidebook map. The headlands bulged strangely, and the harbor was the wrong shape. Why? Puzzled, Jane fetched a stub of pencil from the sideboard and did her best to draw a faint copy of the manuscript coastline over the one on the guidebook. There was no doubt about it, the shapes were not the same. Perhaps the manuscript didn't show Trevisick at all. Perhaps there were two headlands in Cornwall called King Mark's Head. Or perhaps the coast had changed its shape in the hundreds of years since the manuscript had been drawn. How on earth were they to find out? She put the manuscript reluctantly away and stared at the outlines, one in print, one in pencil, that she now had on the page of the book. But she still could find no answer. In exasperation, she flipped back the pages of the book and suddenly caught the sight of the title page again. The Reverend E.J. Hawes Mellor, M.A. Jane jumped to her feet. That was it! Why not? The vicar of Trevisick must know all about the district. He was the expert. He had written the guidebook. He would know whether the coast had changed its shape, and what it had been like before. That was the way to find out. The only way. He was the only person who wouldn't ask why she wanted to know. He would think she was just interested in his book. She must go and find him and ask. And then think how much she would have to tell Simon and Barney when they came home. That was the final thought which decided Jane, normally the shy member of the family, on the way she would spend her afternoon. She turned quickly as the door opened and Miss Paul came rolling in. Finished, Avie? Enjoy it? Lovely, thank you very much. Jane gathered up the guidebook with the precious woolly bundle of her cardigan. Mrs. Polk, she said tentatively, do you know the vicar of Trowsick? Surely, she thought, with all those hymns. Well, not myself personally, no. Mrs. Polk became very grave and solemn. Been in chapel, I don't have no contact with him, though I see un about, of course. Terrible clever man, they do say the vicar is. Was he thinking of taking a look at the church, my dear? Yes, said Jane. After all, I probably shall, she added defensively to herself. 'Tis a beautiful old place. Long way up, though, up the hill at the top of the village. You can see the tower through the trees going up Fish Street from the quay. I think I know. Don't get sunstroke now. Mrs. Polk sailed benevolently out with the dishes, and in a moment Jane heard "Abide with me" echoing with rich, gloomy relish down the hall from the kitchen. She ran upstairs, looked hastily about for a place where she might hide the manuscript case, and finally tucked it among the covers at the foot of her bed, so that it could lie along the edges of the mattress and leave no bump. Then, before her nervousness could get the better of her new idea, she went out, clutching her guidebook, into the sleepy afternoon sun. Gulliver has decided now is the time to play with his ball toy. Oh, you heard your name, did you? The church at the top of the hill seemed cut off from the sea. Jane could see nothing from there but the trees and the hills, and even the little village houses ended some 20 yards down the road. Oh, hi. It is Gulliver time. We all must admire him. Just gotta raise this up a bit so he doesn't bump it. Hi, yes. Oh, hello. You are very cute, yes. It is cuddle time. Look at how cute he is. He is adorable. Oh. The church at the top of the hill seemed cut off from the sea. Jane could see nothing from there but trees and the hills, and even the little village houses ended some 20 yards down the road. The square grey church with its low tower and the big gate posts opposite it might have been in any wooded valley 100 miles from the sea. I'm being distracted by how cute my cat is. Excuse me. In the churchyard, a wizened old man in shirt sleeves and braces was cutting grass with a pair of shears. Jane stopped near him on the other side of the wall. "Excuse me," she said loudly, "but is that the vicarage over there?" The old man, wheezing, straightened himself by holding one arm round to push himself in the small of the back. "That's right," he said laconically, and then just stood there, staring without expression, watching her all the way across the road and up the drive. Jane heard her feet crunching on the gravel enormously loud in the silent afternoon. The big square grey house, its windows empty and lifeless, seemed to dare her to disturb it. It was a very scruffy house, she thought, for a vicarage. The gravel of the drive was clodded with weeds, and in the rambling garden hydrangea bushes grew spindly and neglected, with the grass of the lawns as high as hay. She pressed the bell push by the side of the peeling door, and heard a bell ring faintly inside the house, echoing a long way off. After a long time, when she had just begun to decide with a relief that no one was there to answer the bell, she heard footsteps inside the house. The door opened, creaking resentfully as if it did not often open at all. The man standing there was tall and dark, untidy in an old sports jacket, but at the same time forbidding, with the thickest black eyebrows Jane had ever seen growing almost straight across his brow without a break in the middle. He stared down at her. Yes. His voice was very deep, without a trace of accent. Is Mr. Hawes Malore in, please? The tall man frowned. Mr. who? Mr. Hawes Malore? The vicar. His face cleared a little, though still the intent black browed stare did not relax. Ah, I see. Mr. Hawes Malore, I'm afraid, is no longer the vicar here. He died a number of years ago. Oh, said Jane, and stepped back off the doorstep, not at all sorry at the chance to get away. Oh, well, in that case... Perhaps I can be of some help, he said in the deep, mournful voice. My name is Mr. Hastings. I have replaced Mr. Hawes Malore here. Oh, said Jane again. She was beginning to find the lone Mr. Hastings in a strange, neglected house and garden rather unnerving. Oh, no, I don't want to be a nuisance. It was only something about a book he wrote, a guidebook to the village. A flicker of interest seemed to wake in the vicar's dark face. A guidebook to Trowisic? There was some talk that he had written one, but I have never been able to trace a copy. What was it you wanted to ask? I am afraid if you were looking for the book, I can be of no help. Oh, no, Jane said, not without pride. I've got one. She held her little guidebook up to show him. It was just something inside about the village that I wondered if he'd got wrong. The vicar stared down at the book, opened his mouth to say something, then seemed to change his mind. He held the door wider open and moved his mouth into an uneasy smile. Well, do come in for a few moments, young lady, and we'll see what we can do. I know a little about Trowisic myself after my years here. Thank you very much, said Jane nervously. She stepped inside the door, hitching up the ribbon on her ponytail as she followed him down the passage, and hoping she looked reasonably tidy. Not that she would have been out of place if she had been in rags, she thought, looking round her. That the vicarage was one of the most unloved-looking and shabbiest houses she had ever seen. It was big and rambling and had with more sense of space than the grey house, but the paint was peeling, the walls grubby, and the floors all bare with one or two faded rugs. She began to feel rather sorry for the vicar as he strode stiffly along ahead of her. He led her into a room which was obviously his study, with a big desk strewn with papers, two battered cane chairs with faded cushions, and shelves of books all around the walls. Tall French windows stood wide open to show the stretch of long grass that Jane had glimpsed from the front drive. Now, he said, sitting down behind his desk and clearing a space impatiently on the litter of papers at its top, sit yourself down and tell me what you were going to ask Mr. Hawes Malore. You've found a copy of his book, have you? He stared again at the book in Jane's hand. It seemed to fascinate him. Yes, said Jane. Would you like to have a look at it? She held the book out to him. The vicar took it, slowly, closing his long fingers around the narrow cover as if it were something infinitely precious. He did not open it, but put it down on the desk before him, and looked at it so hard he seemed not to be seeing it, but thinking about something else. Then he turned his grave, heavy-browed face towards Jane again. You are on holiday here? Yes, my name is Jane Drew. I am staying with my family in the Grey House. Are you indeed? That is not a house I am very familiar with. Mr. Hastings smiled rather grimly. Captain Toms has no time for me, I am afraid. A strange, solitary man. We've never met him, Jane said. He's gone abroad. And this book of yours? His fingers caressed its cover almost unconsciously. Is it interesting? Oh, tremendously. I love all the stories about Trowisic, when there were smugglers and things. For a moment, Jane wondered doubtfully whether to mention the map at all, but her curiosity overcame her doubts. She stood up and crossed to stand beside him, leafing through the book to the page with the map of of South Cornwall. This is the bit that puzzled me, the shape of the coastline. I wanted to ask if it had ever been different once. Standing behind the vicar, she could not see his face, but his shoulders seemed to stiffen as he looked at the map, and the fingers of his hand lying on the desk curled gently underneath into the palm. A curious question, he asked. I just wondered. I see there is another line penciled here over the coastline of the map. Is that yours? Yes. From your imagination? The deep voice was very quiet. More or less. Well, that is, I saw something like it somewhere, in a book or something. Jane floundered, trying to avoid mentioning their manuscript in the attic without actually telling untruths. If you know about Trewisick, Mr. Hastings, do you know if the coast has always been the same shape? I should have thought so. A granite coast takes a very long time to change. He was staring at the penciled line. You say you saw this outline in a book. Oh, a book. Or another map, or something, Jane said vaguely. In the grey house? We don't touch the captain's books, Jane said automatically, forgetting that the guidebook must be one of them. But you have looked around them, no doubt. The vicar rose to his feet, towering above her. Reaching a long arm to take a book from one of the shelves, he handed it to Jane. It was very old and covered with shiny scuffed leather, and the pages crackled and gave off the smell of musty age when she opened it. It was called The Tales of Lioness, and had a lot of S's that were printed like F's. Have you seen any book there like that? His voice was persistent. He stood between Jane and the light, and looking up at him, she could see nothing but a faint glint of light reflected from his eyes in the shadowed face. The effect, for a moment, was exceedingly sinister. Jane felt creeping over her the small, cold uneasiness that was becoming familiar about the holiday. A sense of something mysterious that everyone else knew about, but was hidden from her brothers and her. No, I don't think so. Are you sure? A title like that, perhaps. You might have seen a map in such a book. No, really, we just haven't looked. Might you not have seen a volume on a shelf similar to this? I honestly don't know, Jane said, shrinking back in her chair at the urgency that had come into his voice. Why don't you ask the captain? Mr. Hastings took the book back from her and tucked it back into its place on the shelf. The grave, near frown was back on his face. He is not a communicative man, he said shortly. Uneasiness was nudging more insistently at Jane's mind, and she began to fidget from one foot to another. Well, I must be off home, she said, using one of Mother's phrases brightly and hoping it sounded polite. I'm sorry to have interrupted you. She glanced rather wildly from the window to the door. The vicar, standing silent and intent, pulled himself together and moved towards the French windows. You can come out this way. It's quicker. The front door is seldom used. He held out his hand to Jane. I am pleased to have met you, Miss Drew. I am sorry to have not been more helpful, but I must say that it is unlikely that our coast here has ever been any characteristics that are not shown on Mr. Hosmalore's map. He was, I understand, a cartographer of some repute. I am glad you came to see me. He inclined his head gravely as he shook Jane's hand with a strange, archaic gesture that reminded her suddenly of Mr. Withers when he left the grey house. But this, she thought, seemed more genuine, as if it were something which Mr. Withers had been trying to imitate. Goodbye, she said quickly, and ran off through the long, feathery grass toward the drive of the silent, shabby house and the road that led back home. Chapter 5. My voice is feeling pretty good today. It is like 12 pages long, but I think we can make it. If not, I will cut this chapter short. Also, my cat is on my lap, so I can't get up. You know how it is. Chapter 5. When Jane reached the Grey house, Simon and Barney were chattering like monkeys in the living room. To Great Uncle Mary, who sat quietly listening from the depths of the big armchair. Both boys were glowing with excitement, and even Barney's fair skin had been flushed by the wind and sun to a faint pinkish brown. "There you are, darling," Mother said. "I was just beginning to worry about you." Simon hailed her with a yell from across the room. "Oh, you should have come! It was fabulous, like being right out at sea. And when the wind was behind us, we went tremendously fast, far better than a motorboat. Only we came back on the engine because the wind had dropped, and that was fun too. Mr. Withers came back and with us for a drink, and he's gone now. Father went with him to fetch up some of the mackerel we caught." And what's Jane been doing?" said Great Uncle Mary from the corner. "Oh, nothing much," Jane said. "Wandering about." But when all three children went upstairs, sent up early to bed because Father said ominously, when Simon imitated a lightship siren right behind his chair, that they were all overtired, Jane knocked at the door of the boys' room and went in to tell them about her discovery and her visit to the vicar. She did not meet the enthusiastic response she had expected. "You copied out part of the manuscript?" Simon demanded, his voice rising to a squeak of horror. "And showed it to him?" "Yes, I did," Jane said defensively. "Well, for goodness sake, what harm can that possibly do? A little penciled line in a guidebook can't mean anything to anybody." "You jolly well shouldn't have done anything connected with the manuscript unless we all agreed it together." "It wasn't connected to the manuscript as far as he knew. I just told him I wanted to find something out about the coast." Jane forgot any uneasiness she felt about the vicar in a building defense against Simon's indignation. "I thought you'd be grateful. My finding out the manuscript map shows Kenmare Head." "She's quite right, you know," Barney said from his pillow. "It's terrifically important to find that out. For all we know, it might have been a map of Timbuktu. And if it turns out from what the vicar says that Trewisick hasn't changed since our map was drawn, then it's going to help us when we find if there are any clues in the manuscript." "I dare say," Simon said grudgingly, clambering into a bed and kicking off all the blankets. "Oh, well, yes, it does help. We'll talk about it tomorrow." "Then we can start our quest," Barney said sleepily. "Night, Jane. See you in the morning." "Good night." But the morning brought more than any of them had bargained for. Simon woke first, very early. The air was still warm as it had been the day before. He lay in his pajamas staring up at the ceiling for a little while, listening to Barney's peaceful breathing from the other bed. Then he grew restless, so he went out and padded downstairs barefoot, feeling hungry. If he found Mrs. Polk already in the kitchen, he might manage to have two breakfasts. But Mrs. Polk seemed not to have arrived yet. The house was quite silent. It was not until he reached the flight of stairs leading down the hall that Simon first noticed something wrong. Always on his way down to breakfast, he stopped to look at the old map of Cornwall that hung on the wall at the turn of the stairs. But when he looked for it this morning, it was not there. Only a rectangular mark on the wallpaper showed where it had been hung. And Simon glanced down along the wall of the pictures down the stairs. He saw there were several more gaps as well. Puzzled, he went slowly down the hall. He found several strange, naked-looking patches where pictures had been taken down, and the barometer next to one empty space was leaning sideways. Simon went across and straightened it, feeling the bare wooden block of the floor cool under his bare feet. Looking down the long hall, he could see nothing else unusual at first. Then he noticed at the far end, where the sun was streaming in from the kitchen through the open doorway, several of the blocks had been wrenched out and were strewn all over the floor. Simon stared, puzzled. He started down the hall towards the kitchen, and then on impulse turned to his right to reach for the handle of the door into the living room. It squeaked under his touch as it always did, and nervously Simon opened the door and peered around. Then he gasped. The room looked as though a tornado had blown through it in the night. I don't know if my mic picked it up, but there was a fantastically timed sound of wind right there. The pictures hung crooked. Okay, Gulliver, you go check that out. On all the walls, or lay torn from their frames on the floor. The furniture seemed, to Simon's first startled glance, to be completely buried in books. Everywhere there were books. Scattered over the floor, open, closed, upside down, heaped on the tables and chairs, mounded on the sideboard, with a lonely few still lying on the empty shelves. All the locked bookcases around the walls that they had been forbidden to touch were empty. The glass doors hung loose from their hinges, with splintered wood showing round their locks, and one or two, completely wrenched away, were propped against the wall. The shelves had been swept clear of everything they held. The drawers below were open, with papers spilling from them, loose to the chaos of the books. On the floor, there was a faint musty smell, and a thin pall of dust that seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, Simon stood staring, aghast. Then he turned on his heel and raced upstairs, shouting for his father. Everyone was woken from their early half-sleep by his shouting. Led by father, they all stumbled down into the passage in pajamas and night dresses, and followed Simon downstairs, trying dazedly to understand the words tumbling over each other out of his mouth. "What is it? What's the matter? Is the house on fire?" "Burglars!" Father said incredulously, following down the stairs. "Well, you don't get burgled in a village like... Good heavens!" He caught sight of the devastation in the living room, through the open door. As Mother, Jane, and Barney followed his gaze, they fell silent too, but not for long. Wherever they went on the ground floor of the house, they found the same thing. The doors of bookcases had been ripped off, and the books tumbled off the shelves into a chaotic jumble on the floor. Every locked drawer or cupboard had been forced, and the papers from inside scattered wildly about. Even the breakfast room had half a dozen elderly cookery books had been scattered from a shelf. "I don't understand this," Father said slowly. "The place is practically wrecked, but one or two obvious things that are clearly valuable haven't been touched. The statuette on the mantelpiece there, for instance, and that big silver cup on the sideboard in the front of the room. There doesn't seem any point to it at all." "Someone was rejoicing in destruction," Barney said solemnly. Simon said slowly, "They must have made an awful noise. Why didn't it wake us up?" "We're 2 floors away," Barney said. "You can't hear anything up there. I like this. It's mysterious." "I don't," Jane shivered. "Imagine someone wandering about down here all night while we were asleep upstairs. Gives me the creeps." "Perhaps there wasn't anyone," Barney said. "Don't be an idiot. Of course there was. Or do you think all the books jumped off the shelves? It needn't be human. Might have been one of those sort of ghosts that throws things around just for fun. A poltergeist," said Father absently. He opened all the silver cupboards to see if anything had gone. "There you are, one of those." "Well, Mrs. Polk says the house is supposed to be haunted," Jane said. "Oh dear." They all looked at one another, round-eyed, and suddenly shivered. Mother said, appearing suddenly in the doorway and making them all jump, "Well, it's the first ghost I've ever heard of who wore crepe-soled shoes. Dick, come and have a look out here." Father straightened up and followed her out into the kitchen, with the children close at his heels. Mother pointed without a word. 2 kitchen windows were open, the big one over the sink and the small one above it. And so was the door, and on the flat white tiles of the tabletop beside the sink there was the faint but unmistakable outline of a footprint, a large footprint with bar markings across its sole, and the traces of the same markings on the windowsill above. "Gosh, there's your ghost," said Father cheerfully, though he did not look cheerful at all. Then he turned on them briskly. "Now, come on, all of you, off upstairs and get dressed. You've seen all there is to see. No." He waved his hands as all 3 children began to protest vigorously. "This isn't a game. It's extremely serious. We shall have to call the police, and I don't want anything touched before they arrive. Off!" Father had one voice which stopped all argument, and this was it. Simon, Jane, and Barney trailed reluctantly out of the kitchen door and along the hall, then stopped still at the foot of the stairs looking up. Great Uncle Mary was heavily descending the stairs toward them, clad in a pair of brilliant red pajamas and his white hair standing up on end. He was yawning prodigiously and rubbing his eyes in a puzzled kind of way. "Won't do," he muttered to himself. "Can't make it out. Heavy sleep, most unusual." Then he caught sight of the children. "Good morning," he said, with dignity, as if he were fully and impeccably dressed. "Befuddled though I am this morning, a great clamor has been penetrating the stairs from down here. Is anything wrong?" "We've had burglars," Simon began, but Father came striding out after them from the kitchen and clapped his hands. Come on, I told you, go and get dressed." "Oh, there you are, Mary. The most extraordinary thing has happened." He glared at the children, and they hastily ran upstairs. After breakfast, the police arrived from St. Austell, a solid, red-faced sergeant and a very young constable following him like a mute shadow. Simon was looking forward to eager questions about his discovery of the crime. At the very least, he thought vaguely, he would have to make a statement. He was not quite sure what that meant, but it sounded familiar and important. But the sergeant only said to him in his warm Cornish accent, stroking the words, "Came down first, did he?" "Yes, that's right." "Touch anything?" "No, not a thing." Again, I apologize for my really terrible attempt at a Cornish accent, because I've never heard one before well, I'm sure I have, but not recently, and I didn't know it was Cornish. And also, I'm just going with books. I'm so sorry. Not a thing. Well, I did straighten the barometer. It was crooked. Looking around the house, Simon thought how silly this sounded. Hear anything?" "No." "Oh, quite usual, eh? Apart from the mess." "Yes, it was, really." Said the sergeant. He grinned at Simon, sitting eagerly at the edge of his chair. "All right. I'll let you off this time." "Oh," said Simon, deflated. "Is that all?" "I reckon so," said the sergeant. The sergeant said placidly, tugging his jacket down over his stout middle. "Now, sir," he said to Father, "if we might take a look at this footprint you say you found." "Yes, of course." Father led them to the kitchen. The children, drifting behind, peeped through the door. The sergeant gazed impassively at the footprint for some moments, and said to his speechless constable, "Now take good note of that, young George," and moved ponderously out to the disorder of the living room. This all seems so official. "You say there seems to be nothing gone, sir." "Well, it's difficult to tell, of course, since it's a rented house," Father said. "But certainly nothing valuable seems to be missing. The silver's all intact, not that there's much of it anyway. That cup, you see, wasn't touched, but they seem to go for the books, and I can't vouch for those. There may be some missing that we don't know about." "'Tis a proper mess, surely." The sergeant bent down with some effort, picking up a book. A small, deflated black cobweb lay along the top of its pages. "Very old, these. Very valuable. Quite well off the captain is, I believe." "If I might suggest, Sergeant," Great Uncle Mary said, diffidently, from the edge of the group. What is it, Professor?" The sergeant beamed at him all over his rosy countryman face. Even he seemed to know Great Uncle Mary inexplicably well. "I had no chance to look through thoroughly, since the bookcases were locked, but I should have said that very few of the books in this house were valuable, to a dealer at any rate. None of them was worth more than a few pounds None of them was worth more than a few pounds at the outside. Funny. They seem to have been looking for something. Here. Hey, look here." I keep on forgetting what voice I've given this sergeant. There's too many men. The sergeant shifted aside some of the papers, whitening the floor, and they saw a pile of empty picture frames. "Those are from the hall," Simon said at once. "That bumpy gold frame had a map at the top of the stairs." No map in it now. All of 'em ripped out. Still, I dare say, we'll find somewhere in all this clutter." The sergeant rocked to and fro on his heels, gazing with an expression of mild regret at the battered bookcases and piles of books. He rubbed one of his shiny silver buttons thoughtfully, finally turned to father with an air of decision. Sheer hooliganism, I reckon, sir. Can't be no other explanation. Seldom is around these parts, anyway. I don't know what a Cornish accent sounds like, and so I just keep going more Irish. And I am so sorry. Ah, said the young constable regretfully, and immediately turned crimson and looked down at his feet. The sergeant beamed at him. Someone with a grudge against the captain, I dare say. Having a go at his belongings. I don't know what that was. Might well be one or two people hereabouts don't like him. He's a funny old bird. Wouldn't you say so, Professor? You might call him that, great Uncle Mary said abstractedly. He was standing looking about him with a puzzled frown. I'm gonna do my best here, but I swear that's like 5 words crammed into 2. Breaking in isn't difficult. Whatever. Breaking in isn't difficult in a place the size of Trewisick, the sergeant said. I'm not doing that. I can't. People don't expect it. They leave their windows open. Did he lock up last night, Dr. Drew? Yes, I always do. Back in front. Father scratched his head. I could swear there weren't any windows open downstairs, but I must admit, I didn't go round trying them all. Well, no, you didn't expect this sort of thing. Beats me why anyone would want to take the risk just to rough a place up and not pinch anything. Now, if I could have one more look at that print. He led the way out of the room. Simon beckoned Jane and Barney to stay behind. Hooligans, he said thoughtfully. He picked up a book that lay sprawled open downwards at the cupboard and shut its covers gently. On the carpet and shut its covers gently. Nah. It doesn't sound right, somehow, Jane said. It's all so thorough. Every drawer open, almost every book taken down. And every map taken out of its frame, said Barney. It's just the maps, have you noticed? None of the pictures. The burglars must have been looking for something. And they went all through the house because they couldn't find it. Perhaps it wasn't down here, Simon said slowly. Well, it couldn't have been upstairs. How do you know? Don't be silly. There isn't anything upstairs, except us. Isn't there? Well, Jane said, and then suddenly all 3 were looking at each other in horror. They turned and dashed out of the room and up the stairs to the 2nd-floor bedroom, where the great square wardrobe stood between Simon and Barney's beds. Simon hastily dragged a chair forward and jumped up on it to feel round at the top of the wardrobe. His face went blank with alarm. It's gone! There was a fearful moment in silence, then Jane sat down with a bump on Barney's bed and began to giggle hysterically. Stop it! Simon said sharply, sounding for a moment as Stop it! Simon said sharply, sounding for a moment as authoritative as his father. Sorry, it's all right. It hasn't gone, Jane said weakly. It's in my bed. In your bed? Yes, I've got it. It's still there. I clean forgot, Jane babbled, then pulled herself together. When I went to see the vicar, I didn't want to take it with me, so I had to hide it somewhere in my room. So I shoved it right down under the bedclothes. It was the nearest place. Then last night I forgot it was there, and I must have gone to sleep without feeling it. Come on. The front bedroom was full of sunlight, and through the window the sea sparkled as merrily as if nothing would ever disturb the world. Jane hauled back the bedsheet of her rumpled bed, and there, tucked in the corner at the bottom, was the telescope case. They perched in a row at the edge of the bed, and Jane opened the case on her lap. They stared in silent relief at the familiar hollow cylinder of the old manuscript inside. Do you realize, Simon said gravely, this is the safest place it could possibly have been. They could have looked anywhere, but not in your bed without waking you up. You don't think they came up and looked in our rooms? They might have looked anywhere. Oh, but this is silly. Jane swung her ponytail as if she were trying to clear her head. How on earth could they have known anything about the manuscript at all? We found it in an attic, hidden away, and it had obviously been there for years and years. And no one can even have been up in the attic for ages? Think of all that dust on the stairs. I don't know, Simon said. There's a lot of things I don't understand. I only know I've been feeling funny about the manuscript ever since you said that vicar of yours got all excited about the copy of the map. Jane shrugged. I don't see how a vicar could be bad. Oh, Jane, just you wait a few years. That statement will age poorly. Anyway, he didn't know about the manuscript. He asked a few questions, but I think he was just being nosy. Wait a minute, Barney said slowly. I've remembered something. There was someone else asking questions. It was Mr. Withers on the boat yesterday when I was down in the cabin with him getting lunch. He started saying a lot of peculiar things about the gray house. And to tell him if we saw anything that looked very old, he swallowed. Any old books or maps or papers? Oh no, said Simon. It couldn't have been him. But whoever it was, said Barney in a small, clear voice, they were looking for the manuscript, weren't they? Sitting there in the silence of the grey house, they all three knew that it was the truth. They must have wanted it awfully bad. Simon looked down at the manuscript. It's that map part. That's what it is. Someone knows it's in the house. Oh, I wish we knew what it said. Look here, Jane said, making up her mind. We've got to tell Mother and Father about finding it. Simon stuck his chin out. Wouldn't do any good. Mother would be worried stiff. Anyway, don't you see? We shouldn't have a chance to work it out ourselves then. And suppose it does lead to buried treasure. Oh, I don't want any beastly treasure. Something horrible's bound to happen if we do. Barney forgot his fright and outraged ownership. We can't tell anyone about it now. We found it. I found it. It's my quest. You're too young to understand, Jane said pompously. We shall have to tell someone about it. Father, or the policeman. Oh, do see, she added plaintively. We've got to do something, after last night. Children, Mother's voice came from the stairs outside, very close. They all jumped guiltily to their feet at once, and Simon held the manuscript case behind his back. Hello? Oh, there you are. Mother appeared in the doorway. She looked preoccupied. Look, the house is going to be chaotic all this morning. Would you like to go off swimming and come home for a late lunch? About 1:30? Then this afternoon Great Uncle Mary wants to take you all out. Fine, Simon said, and she vanished again. That's it! Barney thumped the pillow in excitement and relief. That's it! Of course! Why didn't we think of it before? We can tell someone and still have things all right. We can tell Great Uncle Mary. All right. I want to keep reading, but I don't know that my voice will... Okay, yeah, this is... Alright, this next chapter is a solid 20 pages, and my voice is not going to hold out for that long, so that's as much as we're going to do for tonight. So yeah. That was pretty good. We got 3 chapters done. Hell yeah. I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as you seem to have enjoyed Something Wicked This Way Comes. I know that one's like more of a book that people seem to want to listen to, but I mean, I just started to do this to read to my friends, and now there are people I don't know actually listening, which is wild to me. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will hopefully see you all soon. Bye bye.